Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. My name is Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts and the host of the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with us, we have Paul Powers. He is a member of the Forbes 30 Under 30. He is the CEO of Physna and the founder of Zoozler. And I invited him to share first about his entrepreneurial journey and why he made the decisions to do what he does. So, Paul, over to you. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much for having me on, Gleb. It's an honor to be here. So real quickly on my own entrepreneurial journey, I started my first company when I was 16 years old. I've always been a bit of an entrepreneur at heart, and that was mostly just a tutoring company. I started off tutoring what I knew, German and how to play the guitar. I don't know how to play it anymore. Used to be able to. And a lot of people would ask if I could tutor them in Spanish. And I thought, well, I'd have to learn that language first. So I realized that I would have, I could just hire other people and they would be able to expand from there. I grew that company into more of a tech-based online learning company, and then later on had several other companies that were in that sort of online sharing space. And when I was over in Germany, it's a long story about I'll keep academia out of it, but lived over in Germany for a long time. And when I was over there, we signed a big contract with this German-based startup. It was about a $40 million contract to basically create the high-tech end of this company, and I would do that here in the United States. I moved back to the United States, built that up. We had 20 engineers over an 18-month period. Over the first month at launch, we had 200,000 users signed on. No marketing. It was all just organic. It was great. And then about the second month in, things were getting really exciting, and we started getting there's some news articles that came out in Germany that were very flattering. But then what ended up happening was the company that we had partnered with in Germany ended up having to take and had to kill the deal for their own financial problems. So we ended up having 2 months left and of runway, and I thought we could either shut it down or we have to turn a profit at that point. So we changed the business around and made it a technology development company. We worked with startups and large enterprises and connected the two to kind of create custom solutions for them. And we worked with AI, AR, mobile, different types of mobile applications, etc. And all the while, I really enjoyed doing that. So that's what Zoozler is. That's what I founded there. And Zoozler's done a great job of helping a lot of entrepreneurs along the way, and getting them started and getting them connected with people who, the solutions, the problems to the solutions, I should say, right? Making those connections happen and helping the solutions to actually get built. While I was there, though, this is shortly out of law school at this point, and had my focus in law was always on intellectual property. It was a commercial attorney, but I was an IP focused one. And the big problem that we saw in intellectual property was that if anyone came to us with the problem of someone stealing their logo or music or something, it was really easy for us to find. But anytime it was something physical, three-dimensional, it was impossible, right? And the only way we would know is after they had damages because of fake Gucci's made or something like that, right? So we weren't able to find it, and I found that the reason for that was because all the different 3D formats were different from each other, and there was no way of interpreting that data. So that's why we founded Physna, which is sort of physical DNA. It's been a very long, complicated journey, and now IP is no longer the only focus of it. It actually helps engineers and designers quite a bit. What we did was we found a way to take that three-dimensional data, normalize it down into code, sort of bridge that gap between digital and physical, right? So literally adding another dimension essentially to software, allowing people to work with three-dimensional data in the traditional software way. What that allows them to do is it gives engineers tools they didn't have before, like being able to search, having autofill in CAD, right? You start to design something and it knows what you're trying to design because someone else in your company has done it before. It can identify all the duplicate models you have, all the near duplicates. It can tell you where parts are located inside other parts without there being a file hierarchy. And it reduces procurement costs by up to 40%. It increases engineering productivity by up to 400% in some cases, especially the larger companies. And it significantly cuts down on inventory, like stock inventory costs, because there's a lot of waste that happens there. So there's several different areas where we help, and that's also where a lot of our work has been focused with enterprise and government agencies recently. Is everywhere from the engineering stage to maintenance.
Yeah, and you were telling me that you're having more business with government agencies recently. So that's great. I'm very glad that Physna is taking off even more than it was before. So tell me, you've had to make a lot of decisions during your entrepreneurial journey. How do you approach making decisions in the first place? What's your process for making decisions?
Well, I try to be as analytical as possible. I mean, I think that you have to use realism to steer you, optimism to guide you. But I firmly believe that pessimism is a useless emotion to have if you're going to be an entrepreneur. If you're going to use the steering wheel and fuel analogies, pessimism really is just a handbrake. And, don't apply a handbrake if you're trying to go fast, you'll get in a crash. So I've been fueled by optimism, fueled by the entrepreneurial, can-do attitude. But when you're making a decision, you have to base it on realism, and that has to be factual, right? And it's easy for people to call pessimism realism, and that's very often people will say that's unrealistic. Well, why is it unrealistic? Well, because no one else ever did that. That's not realism. That's pessimism. That's saying if somebody else couldn't, I must not be able to either. Realism is based in factual numerical data, right? There was this type of market size, etc. So I like to think that that's how I make a decision. That's how I like to think of myself. Now, I am a human, and most humans have a tendency, even though we don't know it, to make emotional-based decisions and then later justify it with facts, right? That's what we do as human beings. So I'm sure that I'm guilty of that, just like everybody else is. And I would say that those probably were the worst decisions I made in my life. Were probably more emotionally driven than factually driven. And it's a really hard balance to hit because you have to look at the data, but you also have to keep that optimistic view. So you have to be able to find what's the optimistic path that still works with data versus looking at data and allowing it to make you pessimistic and then either take no action, or the pessimism bothers you so much from the data that you end up saying, no, the data is pessimism, and you make it a leap without data, which is just stupid, right? So that's the thing that I try to get around is I try to keep in mind that data doesn't have an emotion. Data is what it is. And I like to think that that's how I make decisions.
Excellent. So it sounds like you're really focusing on trying to balance looking at the data whilst being optimistic about the future. And something I was curious about you. So you said, there are people who say, well, that can't be done because nobody did it before, right? Kind of. So do you think that there's a lot of people who are like that, who perceive ambiguity and uncertainty as meaning something can't be done, who kind of confuse those two, ambiguity and uncertainty, for impossible? Tell me, what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I think that almost everybody has that. I would say that's probably an innate human instinct is to do that. We learn from observance, and we observe other people doing certain things. And, I always think it's funny. Every generation has somebody in it that says we've now exhausted technology. We've been saying this for thousands of years. We figured everything out. We figured out bronze. We're done. They think there's nothing else left to uncover. And then there's somebody else in that same generation that proves that person wrong inevitably, and that will always be the case because there's no such thing as an end to creativity, right? It doesn't make sense logically, right? There's never an end to new creations. It's an infinite number of possibilities. So we're only scratching the very beginning of a surface here in technology, and I think that so one of the things I talk to people a lot about that gets me excited, but typically has people scratching their heads, and frankly, if it was the other way around, I'd be scratching my head too, because it's something you have to kind of dive into for a while to really get excited about it, is the concept of things like singularity and and really bridging the gap between 2D and 3D and what that actually looks like. And the first glimpse that most of us have had with that has been in augmented reality. If you ever, and not even that many people have used augmented reality before. Virtual reality is sort of like it, but it's not really the same. And it just kind of starts to mix digital data with your environment around you, and that is that's kind of like the equivalent of Pong, the first video game, or one of the first video games that came out. We're going to look back at the Microsoft HoloLens and similar products, and we're going to view that like Pong. And because the digital world will be so much more integrated into our physical lives. So when I look at people saying things are impossible, I think it's just because we haven't observed certain things, and it's in our instinctive nature to assume if it hasn't been done, it's probably not worth doing. Part of that's a survival instinct, right? If you don't watch your parents eating certain things, you don't eat them because they might be poisonous. So I think that's entrepreneurs. I've said very often in my life, we have almost a problem with our brains, right? So if you could look at it as entrepreneurs being having a defect in a way, because we don't follow a very logical instinct, which is survival mode. If our fears that we have and that keep us from moving are primal. The fear of failure comes from the same part of my brain as the fear of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? So I have the same emotion, and that's what keeps you from taking certain actions in business, because it feels the same to you as going and challenging a tiger. So I think that getting over that is something that some people have an easier time doing than others, but also seeing around corners, and not only getting over the fear part of it, but imagining what else could exist that doesn't currently exist, and how everything could be better potentially without having that fear impulse. That's something that's not innate in us. It's when we have to actually train ourselves to do.
I think that's very wise. It's definitely very important to train ourselves to address this fear impulse. One thing I think about, and that's helpful from the strategy, the research in cognitive neuroscience, and addressing this fear impulse, is to think about, well, what are the costs of not doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of thinking about, we intuitively think about what are the costs of an action, what are the dangers of an action. We don't think about what are the dangers of not acting, what are the dangers of not doing the thing. Has that helped you ever to make better decisions? And have you seen other people make worse decisions because they haven't acted?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely helped me. I think it helps personally. That helps me in times of very large decisions, right? Well, ones that I'm very scared of, and I have to say, okay, there is a risk involved with any major decision, with any decision really, but especially major ones, life-changing decisions. And the question you have to run through your mind is, what is the risk involved of not doing something? Now, because of that same inability or reluctance to imagine what will happen if you do something right, we also have a reluctance to imagine what will happen if we don't do something. Because typically, if you don't do something, nothing happens, so you don't think of it as a negative consequence. And you're right; it's not maybe negative; it's a lack of a positive. So,
Yes.
is that a cost? It's up to you. But the way I view it, and the way that I talk to myself internally, and I don't know how I can't speak for everybody else, but I always view it as, what will you say to yourself in the future if you don't do this, especially if it's a big decision, right? My biggest fear in life by far, I mean it, is to be on my deathbed one day saying, man, I really wish I fill in the blank, right? I don't want that. Regret scares me more than anything. I'd rather have tried and failed than to regret not trying. At least I know that that it was a failure if I try.
Yeah. No, I totally understand what you mean. I mean, as an entrepreneur myself, my entrepreneurialism is in the idea space, but that's definitely something I think about a lot. Kind of, what do I want to not have regretted trying? And sometimes I'll fail, and that's okay. The costs of failure, we tend to overimagine the negative costs of failure. The research in cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics shows that we're way too much afraid of the costs of failure. We are much more afraid of losing something than gaining something real. Whereas
it's fun. So I've read the same research. And I think it goes back to what I was saying. Our brains are wired for survival, and it's not survival that we have to worry about anymore. You're going to, I mean, assuming you live in a Western country, you're probably going to be able to get access to food and shelter and stuff, and you're probably not going to be dying of some awful disease that you picked up off of a rat in a sewer. I mean, so you're probably going to have overcome most of the normal primal things that human evolution went on for a much longer time than technology happened, right? So we've got hundreds of thousands of years of evolution where we always had to be afraid of giant cats, and then all of a sudden we have 100 years where there's no such thing as these cats anymore. Well, I mean, you know what I mean. You get the point. Where we don't have to worry about animals anymore, and we have, what defines success isn't I managed to not get killed by someone with a club. It's I managed to build up a company and thrive. So it's not striving for survival, striving for thrival, essentially, or for thriving.
I like that. Starting for thrival
requires a total rewiring of your mind, and everyone has. I have it too. It's to be lying to say I didn't. It's you're scared to death of what if I fail, and you are a little motivated by what if I succeed. And getting over that, sometimes the data helps you get there. Sometimes looking at it numerically says, hey, if I don't do this, I will lose 100% of the opportunity. If I do try to do this, I lose this much of whatever I'm working with, and at least I've learned something. And I think viewing the biggest way to get over that fear for me personally has been to view failure differently. And that's one thing I think that the startup community does pretty well, is they start to look at failure as moments in history or lessons to you. And I would say that some of the best things that ever happened to me were failures. Things that I did wrong ended up making me learn something and take a new and more informed approach on a different thing that I never would have made if I was more successful. And I can tell you for a fact that I don't think that I would be where I am today if everything I initially set out to do had worked. I think I'd be much further behind where I am.
So Uh, that's a great point. So I'm curious to dive into a little bit into these failures, into some decisions that you regretted, decisions that you wished you would have made differently. Can you tell me about a couple of examples, one or two, of a decision that you regret, a major decision that you would have wished you made differently, and what you know now that would have caused you to make the decision differently?
So okay, so a lot of there's a number of them. I don't. I'm hesitant to use the word regret. You know, I really am
Okay.
because when I look at the failures and I'm like, thank God that happened to me. You know, at the
Okay.
time, I mean, if this happened to me yesterday, I would be able to say, I raise my hand. This is my biggest regret. What just happened to me. But looking back, I really do have to say, if they
Mhm.
didn't happen to, if I play the story onward, it wouldn't have been as good, right? So looking back, I don't regret them, but the things that were mistakes that I'd made that led to the failures that I had. So Zoozler is not a failure; it's a success because we were able to fix the company and get it to a profit within 2 months, and that was very hard to
Mm.
do. That was a success, but it was born out of a failure of us being 100% reliant on another company's financial
Ah.
prosperity, and because of that reliance, when they went sort of under it's a complicated story, but when they lost their funding, essentially we lost ours, even
Mm.
though we were killing it. We were way ahead of where we needed to be. If we had their investors in us, we would have been everyone would have been doubling down, right? Instead, they had a problem and they had the money taken. So that was a lesson to me, that don't
Mm.
overly rely on a third party and bet all of your chips on one horse. Because I had actually left the law firm, I'd done everything, and I'm happy I did. Again, I don't regret it. But at the time, I realized that was a little bit foolish of me to be that confident in one scenario playing out
Mm.
exactly that way, right? Because there's other things that could have happened too that also would have led to problems. I'm happy that it happened because it forced me to I literally had to get in the car and I had to drive. I didn't have enough time to start marketing or whatever. I had to supply 20 people full time off of sales that I was able to make personally. We didn't have a sales team. So I had to
Ah.
get in my car
Wow.
and I would drive around to companies and I would talk to them about their technical issues and we would basically solve it on the spot. We would come up with a contract, and by the end of the second month of just all day and night driving it. And if it was nighttime, I would drive into like a vape shop or something because it was the only thing that was open. I would talk to them about, let's talk about how we can improve your what you have going on here, even
Wow.
though you barely understand how Excel works. So it was a big challenge, but we overcame it. And I think that was just another lesson for me. It was like, hey, I can do that. I can sell stuff. I can, if I in an emergency or whatever, or not, I don't want to wait for an emergency, but I can actually present these things and sell these things on my own. I don't have to rely on somebody else. So I not only learned that that's foolish to rely on someone, but I learned I don't need to, right? I
Mhm.
actually can learn how to do these other things on my own. And I've been selling, but it's a different type of sale. It's much more complicated, nuanced, because of all the different elements involved. And so I feel like the other regrets that I've made in life have been people I've hired.
Mm.
Um, and maybe people I didn't fire when I should have. And
Ah.
that is a good, I think, maybe in a good example of where emotions, I think, dealing with humans is a very emotional thing. It's very difficult to
Sure.
distance a human, to view a human being purely numerically, because they're a human and you care and you want and you believe in people. Maybe when there's not even a logical reason to, right? And you convince yourself that there's a logical reason to. This intuition and some gut feelings are good. I would say 9 out of 10 times your quote unquote gut really is a part of your brain talking to you and
Mhm.
saying, I've experienced something like this before. This reminds me of something good. But that other 1 out of 10 times, it's a very bad thing to listen to because it can be very biased, right? You might say, I really want to hire this person. You don't know why, it's your gut. But your
Mm.
gut could be saying that because when you were an infant or a toddler, someone who looked like that gave you a lollipop, and now you associate that. I mean, you don't know why you have the
Sure.
feeling is the thing. Right? You don't know if it's logical or illogical. So, some of my biggest regrets, and I will call those regrets, even though I learned from
Mm.
them. I don't think that I think I could have learned the lesson faster. Was not getting rid of people when it became clear that they were not going to work out.
Okay.
Hiring people, I would say I didn't necessarily regret it so much. Now, long term, I regret it at the time, and I still kind of wish that I hired somebody else. But I learned from those experiences, and hiring and firing to me has been something where I feel like I've learned the most,
Okay.
and I've had to learn the most about distancing performance from intuition.
Mm. So it sounds like the three areas that you learned and you wish you would have known more from the very beginning would be to not put all your chips in one basket, all your eggs in one basket with a large company, and also to distance yourself more emotionally from the hiring and the firing. of people?
I would only tweak that first one just a tiny bit, and I would say you're totally fine with you putting all your eggs in one basket. Make sure that you're holding the basket, right?
Okay.
Don't put them in somebody else's basket. If you're all your eggs in somebody else's basket, that's especially if you don't have a really strong relationship and a lot of data about how they work. I think that's a big risk.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to bring up was kind of the gut. We make a lot of mistakes. And I think you and I talked about this in the presentation that I gave. We make a lot of mistakes when we go with our gut, partially because we confuse the learned instincts that we have, kind of the learned behaviors that we learned over time, good decisions that we learned to make, from those just primitive savanna reactions, which is talked about kind of confusing someone who gave you a lollipop for someone who looks like that, or someone who has the same name, or something like that.
Right.
So those are dangerous reactions. How have you learned, what have your strategies been to distance yourself from those natural emotions that we have when dealing with people for hiring, firing, and other tough people decisions?
I typically find that I have to take a step back, right? So if I have a really strong emotion about something, positive or negative, because sometimes the gut's not always saying go hire this person, saying don't, or don't do this or whatever. And sometimes I had to take a step back and say, okay, why am I having that reaction or not having a reaction? Like, okay, let me try to figure out my gut. You don't always, but sometimes you do. You can say, okay, I think I know why I feel that way, and it's because I read this article a while back or whatever, and then try to say, okay, if I were to take that to the side, I know how I feel. I know how my gut's going to vote. Okay, how is my brain going to vote? Okay, so let's go through all the data logically. And then sometimes you have to make a call, and it's not always the brain that wins. This is where I will say that I sometimes think the gut is something useful. Sometimes I'll look at the data, and it's typically there's a lack of data. I don't like making decisions on a lack of data. I hate that, right? That's my least favorite thing to do because I feel like that's really like going to a casino to me, not like something you control over. So I don't like it when there's a lack of data, but unfortunately, when you're doing new things, and Physna is all about new things, there's always a lack of data around.
You're an entrepreneur, right?
And so I get as much data as I possibly can. I think about it as logically as I can, but typically my brain comes to a point where it's like, look, this could go any number of 5 ways, right? And any one of these 2 routes could be the right one. And the way to handle that is at that point, you say, okay, gut, what are you telling me to do? And your gut will say, hey, I have a really strong feeling this is the way to do it. And they say, maybe you know something my brain doesn't, and since it's neutral to my brain, let's do it that way, right? And then, but the way to do that safely is, I'm a big risk taker. My whole life's been about taking risks. I never go to. I hate casinos because that's not a risk. That's gambling is not the same thing as to me as risk taking. Calculated risk taking is smart. You can't make anything in life happen or achieve anything positive without risks. It's impossible, right? So you have to take risks, but you have to calculate the risk. And you have to say, I'm going to go all in on something, but if I get out of it, but I can do that because I know that if this happens, I still can do this, or I'm going to go down this avenue, but I'm going to do this avenue versus that avenue because if this avenue doesn't work, it's easier for me to pivot to this one versus the other way around, or what. Like, you have to think through that strategically. And then the gut at the end of the day, I think, should be, when you get to a tie, you should say, listen to the gut, because there's a very good chance that the gut is a part of your brain that remembers something or is thinking through a thought that's not very front of mind. That it's a subconscious thought as well. The gut is so your subconscious mind, right? So it notices something that you're not thinking of actively, and maybe that's worth listening to. But listening to only that and absence of data or despite data, I think can be very dangerous.
I think that's absolutely a wise approach to it. Sounds like you're looking at the data, and only when the data can't really clearly lead you in one direction and the other, you're looking at your gut. Something that is also to think about is that the gut is wrong in specific, clear situations. So, for example, when you're dealing with someone who is in some obvious way not a member of your tribe, whether it's demographic background or psychographic background and so on, we are likely to perceive that person in a more negative way than we should, and the opposite for the opposite. So there are specific ways that your gut, and these are called cognitive biases, where your gut is likely to lead you astray, and you need to watch out for those in particular when you're considering your gut. Great.
I think that's a really great point. And I don't know if this is possible, but I would think that a great way to overcome that would be to try to proactively train your gut a little bit differently. So, sometimes when I know where you're coming from. There's also innate positive emotions that we should have that maybe we shouldn't have, and all this other stuff. But I think that as you mature and as you experience things, you start to get a new gut, essentially, right? You have the one you're born with, which is all these problems with it. And then after a while, you have one from just having done so many things. It's kind of, it's like an automatic reaction type thing. You know, if somebody comes in here and tries to do a certain type of deal with me, I will have a gut reaction to the proposal they're giving me. I wasn't born with that because I wasn't born knowing what a contract is, right? But I have a gut reaction because I've gone through so many of certain types of things. I know how I react. Or somebody calls me on the phone, I have a gut reaction on whether or not it's a telemarketer, right? It's not something I was born with. I wasn't born knowing telemarketers, but you get it over time. So I think you can train your gut. So maybe there's a differentiation that at some point someone will have to make.
Absolutely. No, the thing with the gut is that the gut itself, the way it feels, it doesn't intuitively differentiate between whether it's a telemarketer or whether it's a harmful reaction, like let's say have a lot more sweets. You know, in the same way that we haven't been learned how to drive a car, but now when we drive a car, we drive it in autopilot. It feels very comfortable, intuitive. So we need to think about, is this an area, and here's what the research says, is this an area that we have made a lot of correct decisions in the past that we can be confident that we've made, you know, like determining whether someone's a telemarketer or whether they're proposing a good deal? Or is this a new area that I don't have experience in? And it's a new area I don't have experience in, then it's not a good idea to trust your gut, to simply trust your gut. So you've learned over your career a lot of good decision-making strategies like we're talking about. What kind of advice can you give to others who are starting in their entrepreneurship to help them along so that they don't make some of those regrettable mistakes that you now wish you wouldn't have made, and so that they can learn from you, from your experience in the future?
Well, I mean, I think that if I had to give advice purely on how to avoid mistakes, it would be to learn as much as possible before you make certain types of decisions. But that's a statement that I don't think is going to help people quite as much, because it's something that everyone kind of intuitively knows. So what I feel like I can offer that I've learned that's a little more valuable, and maybe you can add something to them, would be, you are going to make mistakes. I mean, you're not going to be able to avoid them. They are going to happen. There's a big difference, though, between people who fail totally fail because of their mistakes, and people who make mistakes and are the most successful people you've ever heard of. You know, everyone alive has made mistakes. There's not a single human who hasn't. And the ones that you hear about who look like their life has been perfect, I promise you it's not. They failed early, they failed often. But the only thing that differentiates people at the end of the day is not that some people will make a mistake and some people won't. Some people are going to have a hard board meeting and some are not going. No, they're all going to have problems at some point along the line. It's how you deal with it when it happens. So viewing mistakes when they happen as a learning experience is, I know that that's almost a cliche, but people have to really think about that for a moment. When a bad thing happens to you, and I did mention before that some of my failures have been my biggest successes in the way, right? Like they led to the biggest successes. That's not automatic, right? If something bad happens to you, it doesn't mean that now you're a better person. No, now you've been hurt, right? But if you view it the right way, it does make you a better person. If you say, okay, why did that happen? And it also kind of trains your gut, because that very strong emotion you have when something negative happens, it trains your mind to fear certain scenarios that are similar to that. So sometimes that is a trained gut type thing, right? I have a gut reaction to not do this because last time I did that, I lost a bunch of money, right? So those are things to learn from. I would say make sure that when you have failures, don't ever seek out a failure, right? Don't go looking for failures. I wouldn't do that. But when they inevitably happen, despite your best efforts and despite everything else that you try to do, try to view that as an opportunity, because sometimes failures are the best opportunities to make a pivot. And sometimes that pivot will be 100 times better than the road you were already going down. And just at the moment, it's not easy to see that. You're emotional, your brain is flooded with negativity, and that negativity, that pessimism, like I mentioned, it's a handbrake. You don't want to go anywhere because you're so upset and you think, I'm going to fail at anything I do. You have to be able to reignite that engine and give yourself more gas, and then use that newly found realism to know, okay, well, I can't go that direction and this way, because if when I do that, I run into that wall over there that I ran to last time. So I'm going to do a different thing. So I would say the emotional handling of failure is probably, in my mind anyway, for an entrepreneur, at least as important as the ability to avoid the mistakes in the first place.
Excellent. So it sounds, the emotional handling of failure, I really like that. And a couple of other points I want to bring up that you said is the seeking thriving, kind of not seeking to not die, but seeking to thrive. I think that was a good, really thoughtful, interesting point that you brought up. Another one is to not go gambling into casinos versus taking risks. I think one of the things about casinos is that it's a stupid risk because you're essentially, casinos are going to make money on you. You keep making that same risk over time. It's not a calculated risk. It's entertainment, essentially. Whereas what you're talking about is taking risks where you're likely to make more money rather than less money if you take that risk a number of times. So that's another point that I heard you make that I thought was really helpful. And a third point, and this was something interesting, when you talked about when you're getting to a point where you're not certain about which route to take and you have 5 routes, to take a route where if you fail, you can most effectively recover, most easily recover. And I thought that was another interesting point as well.
Thank you.
All right, great. Is there any other final thoughts you want to leave the audience with, and remind the audience once again what you do and how you do it?
No, I would say if I had to sum it up, I would say 2 quick sentences. One is, 2 quick statements. One would be, I think this leads to failure more than anything in my mind, is, don't choose a path, choose a goal, and then make a path. Right? I think that's a very important way to think, and that's very different than how we're taught to trained to think in school. The other thing I would say is that if you're going down a path that's already been paved, you can't expect to get somewhere that no one else has ever been. So if you have really high aspirations, you have to go places that and do things in certain ways that haven't been done before. You inevitably are going to fail along the way over and over again. Try to use some judgment in your pursuit of that. Like I said, Physna, we deal with 3D models. We democratize 3D modeling and engineering. That space, unfortunately, was ignored for decades, and it costs us, the world economy, many billions of dollars a year because they never address these problems. We still run into constant crossroads where we have to say, are we going to put money in this or in that? Are we going to build this thing or that thing? Are we going to pursue this customer or that customer? And we have to rely on data, and only when the data is totally neutral and there's no logical reason to pursue one strategically over the other, which is very rare, very, very rare. Is that actually the case? Would you say, let's go with a gut reaction? But I would say so rare that it's not even really worth thinking about. And you're much more likely to be the case that you're just being a little bit too lazy to go look for the data. so I would say go look for the data first.
I like that. Go look for the data first.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, this has been another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. And this time we've talked to Paul Powers, the CEO of Physna and a member of Forbes 30 Under 30. And once again, my name is Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance and the author of Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Till next time, my friends, and the wisest